Who was Loja Saarinen? She was a very active member of one of the most artistic families in the 20th century. But if you only know one Saarinen, it's probably Eero, her architect's son. Even at Cranbrook, where Loja Saarinen lived and worked for more than 25 years, there's a bit of a misconception that her role was limited to being the mother of two talented designers, Eero and Pipsan, and the wife of Elil Saarinen, architect and president of Cranbrook. But perhaps the most persistent myth about Loja Saarinen is that she was a weaver. It's an easy mistake to make. Loja helped create many remarkable rugs for Cranbrook, and they are often labeled by Loja Saarinen. They came out of the workshop that bears her name, Studio Loja Saarinen. But she herself was not sitting at a loom day in and day out weaving. That's not how her business operated. So how do we find out more about her, about Loja? She seemed to constantly erase herself, putting her own work behind that of her husband, and later her son. She didn't leave us with a vast archive of writing, and there aren't signed sketches or drawings of her rugs, and the textiles that came from her studio have mostly been rolled up and put into storage, or worn threadbare and tossed out. She was a formidable woman, but without a dominating personality. So, who was Loja Saarinen? And where can we find her? When so much of her artistic legacy is missing, and her workshop, her process, so misunderstood, how do we unroll the story of Loja Saarinen?
I was a chubby little rascal. That's great. Back in the days, you could buy Tootsie Toy cars, and so I would use the pattern in this particular carpet for highways and places to park and all that kind of stuff.
My grandmother made me this dress, a pinafore with its gorgeous green fabric and lovely velvet waist made me feel like a queen when I was very little.
The cushions on the cozy corner, we used to use the pillows and make tunnels of the pillows. You could feel it against your skin and against your arms, and it was just fun to cuddle up in, and you just feel safe inside. Loja Saarinen was my grandmother.
I knew her as Mormor. Mormor is Swedish for your grandmother on your mother's side. My grandfather was a partner in a very well-known architectural firm in Finland. Loja had two offspring. One was Eero and one was Pipsan. My uncle, Eero, was an architect, a well-known architect, and my mother was an interior designer.
Loja stayed in the shadows. She did it on purpose. She was always very proper. Everything was very well thought out.
When I walked into Saarinen House, I essentially walked into a Finnish household. Very European, very reserved, well-behaved.
If there was a dinner, there'd be a list of who sits where and all that stuff.
Crafts were so much a part of our nightly discussions around the dinner table. What's the difference between Brancusi and Hans Arp? How do you design the perfect teapot? All of the discussions were about art and design every night at dinner, or some aspect of art and architectural history.
And she was a tremendous cook too, and did pastries, and she did Swedish pancakes with lingonberry sauce.
She also was quite a fashion plate. I remember her as always being dressed to the nines. Her bathrobe would be just so.
She could thread a needle without glasses when she was 80 years old. She had the smallest, tiny stitches in every piece she did.
All the time, she was just as proper as this house is. Everything had its place. She was a very elegant woman.
Loja studied sculpture in Paris for 2 years. Her brother was one of the partners, Chavez, Lindgren, and Saarinen. Elil was introduced by Herman Giselius to Loja, and they struck it rich together. I mean, they were just a wonderful couple, and she was very straight, she was very Germanic, she was very loyal, kind, helpful, all to him, and also a great hostess to all his characters. Eliel loved the piano, loved Mahler, loved Sibelius. They all got along really well, and they would come and party, and Loja was doing the moonshine, and these nights, these things went, very often went into the next day. In the 20s, right after World War I, there was no money, and he was an architect. He was doing city plans for nothing.
My grandfather entered the Chicago Tribune building competition, and he won second prize. Oh my gosh, here's somebody that's never even seen a skyscraper win second prize in this very important, probably the most important competition of his time. So he got a lot of notoriety. So that encouraged him to come to America. Loja and Eliel came to the United States in 1922 and went to Chicago. Eliel had quite a reputation. He came to the University of Michigan College of Architecture and was a visiting professor. And at that time, there were two young gentlemen in the architectural school. One of them was J. Robert F. Swanson, my father, and the other one was Henry Booth. I think it really was a combination of two of them that encouraged him to come to Cranbrook.
She was the head of the weaving department here, but she was really in sort of a roughly speaking, she was Eliel's right-hand partner and go-to person, and really, really controlled the ship. She was trained as an artist, she was trained as a photographer too, and she had lots of her own skills.
Anytime Eliel worked on a project, she worked on the project with him, but his name was on it. Her influence was there very much. He was the headliner. They were very much aligned in their thinking about total works of art. My grandfather first expressed his philosophy almost as a continuum between art and architecture and music and sculpture, everything being related to everything else. And Studio Loja Saarinen gave her her own way to express her thinking.
She was his best sounding board, I think, and they were very collaborative together. Half the rugs in here are designed by Eliel, but the other half are designed by Loja. But she wasn't just a textile creator. She was into color, she was into form. He basically said, you always design for the next biggest thing. So a chair in a room in a house in a landscape. That's the simple way to say it, but it really means everything. In Cranbrook, they were a team, a really good team.
In the Cranbrook development, Loja Saarinen was to play a major role. One of the earliest professional interactions between Loja Saarinen and George and Ellen Booth, the founders of Cranbrook, came in the form of an enormous architectural model. Based on plans for the Academy of Art by Eliel, Loja built the model in Ann Arbor and delivered it to Cranbrook House in May of 1925. Her role as a model maker had begun earlier in 1912, and by the time she made the Cranbrook model, she was quite adept at using plasticine clay for the construction of tiny, realistic buildings. Wooden elements, painted sponges, and dried plants enhanced the photorealism of the display, which Loja then photographed herself. The Saarinens moved to Cranbrook in the fall of 1925. By late 1926, Loja was working 6 hours a day in Eliel's office, and in 1928 she was receiving $1 an hour from the Cranbrook Foundation for model making. Loja's models were set up in Cranbrook House and served as a vision statement for the new community they were to help the Booths build. The Booths and Saarinens had a warm relationship. They genuinely respected each other's work and enjoyed each other's company. They also held similar aesthetic beliefs rooted in the arts and crafts movement. It was this shared spirit that led to the most transformative interaction between George Booth and Loja Saarinen. Booth proposed that Loja design textiles for her husband's buildings, and he suggested they could be woven back in Finland. Loja's response was plucky. Why don't I design them, and why don't we weave them here at Cranbrook? This origin story shows the initiative Loja took as an artist and entrepreneur, and how textiles were conceived from the very start as part of the total design of every Cranbrook institution. And so, at the age of 49, with no real training in weaving, Loja Saarinen set out to open a weaving workshop. She called it Studio Loja Saarinen, and it opened in October of 1928. A month later, the first product, Cranbrook Rug No. 1, was completed. Loja designed it, and it was woven by Valborg Norquist Smalley, and it's in the style of an Islamic prayer rug, featuring a tree of life at the center with the year 1928 around the trunk. At the top left is a little sculptor working on his art, and on the top right, a little house representing architecture. Studio Loja Saarinen started with a single loom, but grew to encompass more than 30 looms. Early the next year, the other Cranbrook Arts and Crafts studios opened: an iron shop, a silver shop, a print shop, a bookbinder, and a cabinet maker, all led by men, joined Studio Loja Saarinen in crafting objects and beautiful functional art for the growing Cranbrook campus.
It's amazing to work in a building where you have floating in the space above, like the angels in heaven, depiction of women and men who are raising various crops used to produce fibers that are used in weaving, shearing an animal over at the end. I was invited to come here as head of what was called the fabric design department at that time. I was exactly 30 years old. I arrived from Southern California. Within hours, somebody took me into this room to say, this is the beginning of it all. I learned sometime later that this was the weaving studio that Loja had used, and where many of the textiles that were used here at Cranbrook and were sold to other places in various parts of the country and beyond were made. The textiles at Cranbrook complete the vision of the architecture. I believe that Eliel and Loja were an ideal team as far as that's concerned. I discovered on an early walk around the campus, especially going into the area of the boys' school, you look in front of you and spread out before you is this amazing field of patterning. Immediately, I thought about textiles, rugs, the history of carpets in the Western world in particular. Then going into the dining hall, all those leaded glass windows. First thing I think about is lace curtains. The fact that the textile brings a kind of softness, a kind of a tactile implication, and a scale relationship that helps to build a connection from the architecture to the intimate connection of each individual that operates in that space. This is a textile which was once on one of the windows here at the Academy. You know, and I think it's interesting just to look at from what it tells us about the values that Loja Saarinen had and the people who work with her in her studio. It's a textile that's made of linen and wool. Linen is incorporated at the borders of the textile, which are more sturdy, because these curtains you held with your hand and moved, opened and closed. And the field of the textile, on the one hand, has a golden color to it, but you should see this against the light. As the light penetrates it, that color shifts, it glows. So that wool has the ability to transmit light in a very special way. And then beyond that, what she does along the borders of the textile with this inlaid pattern, I don't know if that's S for Saarinen, or just a very happy motif that was frequently used in a lot of the decorative work here at the Academy. But this is inlaid and done in such a way that there are gaps around it which, hung against the light, read as little spots of light that also enter the room. So the textile has a life to it. It's not just a means to keep the outside out and the inside in, nor a space to just provide privacy, but it is in fact a dramatic part of the language of separation. The wall that keeps us from infinity has got to be a living membrane, right? The only thing between us and forever is that wall. So why not make it into something that's really beautiful, wonderful, and has a life to it as well?
Loja Saarinen was skilled in various handicrafts, but she also knew to hire the right people. And in 1920s, the highest quality weaving was unrivaled by the Swedish. Maja Andersson Virda was an established artist working in Stockholm when Loja lured her away to Cranbrook in 1929. Within the structure of the studio, she had a very active role in both designing and executing the textiles. It was Virda who attracted the young ambitious weavers such as Lillian Holm and Ruth Ingvarsson. These two books were created by Ruth Ingvarsson, and we can see on the cover of this one a Swedish loom, and this one showing folk characters woven into the silk covering. These were essentially instructional weaving manuals. Even though they shared a Nordic heritage, Loja really considered the studio an American venture. And in fact, she's quoted in this 1929 article as saying, "But we are not trying to copy the work of the European craftsmen. Instead, we are studying the yarns and threads available here and are seeking to develop patterns and fabrics which will meet a need in this country." So we know that Loja didn't do a lot of weaving herself, but she did have small looms in her house where she would create samples like these. She used hand-dyed yarns that she did herself and worked out the different colors, textures, and designs, which would then form the basis for materials to be purchased in bulk for the finished products. And we can see exactly what those materials are, the quantities they were ordered in, who they were ordered from. We also have some work orders and receipts like these that show the construction of the first looms that these weavers used.
This is the Kingswood Weaving Studio. This is the largest hand weaving studio in North America. We house 60 floor looms here. This is a high school as well. Each student gets one loom for the entire semester. The Cranbrook loom is a special loom in that it both raises and lowers the thread of the warp. Most looms just raise one set. Marie Bexell was one of her weavers that wove the textiles for Loja, and her husband, John, was a cabinet maker. So he and Loja collaborated to create the countermarch technology of the Cranbrook loom. A huge part that cannot be underestimated in the making of textiles is the design process, and this is where Loja and Eliel played a huge role. Loja used two weaving structures on the loom. One is called inlay. It's a supplemental technique called kultokudos. So that's where you have a basic plain weave ground or grid, and then you place a secondary thread on top of that foundational thread. Raya is just simple knots. You're weaving with a plain weave ground, and then it's a supplemental weft where you're tying knots. And usually the tufts, the ends of the knots, the tails come up and create the pile on top of the weavings. The Cranbrook looms are incredibly successful. I call them the Cadillac of looms.
Eliel Saarinen said he had 3 main ideas when he was designing Kingswood School for Girls. The first was to make it feminine and youthful, and he used colors like rose, light blue, and green throughout the design. The second was to make it distinctly American and of its age. And the third was to make it one with nature. The design of Kingswood occupied the entire Saarinen family. Eliel designed the buildings and gates, Eero designed the furniture, Hipsan designed the interior colors and decorative paintings, and Loja took care of the rest. She selected everything, not only overseeing the design and production of rugs, curtains, and wall hangings that adorn the spaces, but also selecting everything from the plates and cutlery the girls used in the dining room to the bedding that covered them as they slept. No detail was overlooked with Loja at the helm, everything harmonized. And the biggest weaving in the grandest room, the Festival of the May Queen. I especially love the little dog on its hind legs, the tray of oranges, and that all the maidens are wearing the little black pumps that we see Loja Saarinen wearing in her studio. As Loja explained, the value of handwoven textiles lies in the fact that, quote, "In no other way can the texture and color of the fabric be so perfectly controlled in relation to its surroundings or made so logical a part of a given whole. Carpets extend and elaborate the architectural scheme. Repeated motifs create new depth and texture. Simple forms of the building become increasingly rhythmic and beautiful in the textiles." Taken as a whole, at Kingswood, architecture, art, textiles, and nature are more than the component parts.
Loja Saarinen played an essential role in weaving together architecture and nature at Cranbrook. The landscape design employs principles of the arts and crafts movement, changing in formality, texture, and scale as it moves away from the buildings. Interior and exterior are connected through art. Here at Saarinen House, the dining room opens onto a paved terrace with grass joints that repeat the design of the rug inside. The dining room wall is completely covered by a tapestry made in Finland by Greta Skogstad Lehtinen. Its tree and flying birds were a mirror of the garden outside. And Loja coordinated the purchase of Kivi's Muse, a sculpture by Finnish artist Väinö Aaltonen that seems to flit through the center of the courtyard. Loja entertained her family, friends, and the artists and students of Cranbrook here, and in warm weather, the daily life of the house centered around the courtyard. In the Saarinen family's home movies, we can watch her grandchildren playing among her flowers.
The garden at Saarinen House is very much a kind of a cove. It was a beautifully crafted space that invited people to inhabit. Eliel used to walk every day through nature. He was very dedicated to the idea that nature is our first and most important influence.
Loja's planting scheme softened the edges of the architecture. Ivy, wisteria, and climbing roses clung to the walls, blurring the transitions between garden and house. Landscape architect Diana Balmori wrote that these vines hung as outdoor draperies, repeating the language of Loja's curtains inside. Each fall, Loja made lists of annuals for Cranbrook's head gardener, Mike Vetrano, to prepare in the greenhouses for spring planting. As if she were sketching a rug, Loja would draw up colorful pattern planting plans for garden beds around campus. Like textiles, gardens are ephemeral and they fade over time. Few traces of Loja's planting plans remain. It can be difficult to grasp exactly what Loja did here at Cranbrook because we don't have a paper trail that documents the full scope of her work. Like many women of her time, Loja's unpaid and unacknowledged labor was absorbed into the institutional roles of her husband. Her work wasn't properly valued, and so it wasn't properly documented.
Yeah, and when you compare it to Eliel Saarinen and all of his blueprints that all have his name associating him with his buildings, there's really very little evidence about Loja's other work. You have to look at sort of single notes where she references jobs she's done, or the one surviving example of her changes to the landscape in a memo to the grounds crew. And it gets equally confusing when you actually start looking at the textiles. On most of her weavings, you see on the back it will say by Loja Saarinen. By labeling them by Loja Saarinen, it feeds into this idea of this modernist artist genius in the way that a sculptor or a painter produces a single object. But with textiles, there is a real differentiation between design and execution.
What we do know about Loja is that she was a designer organizer. She was a leader who structured the process of design and organized the networks of production. I love the photo of Loja and Eliel Saarinen standing in front of one of the working drawings for her tapestries, where she's pointing things out with such authority and mastery over her craft. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for Studio Loja Saarinen in our archives is this pamphlet.
I love the logo in the center that was probably designed by Eliel, and it really riffs on the graphic quality of the loom. I also love that the weaver sitting at the loom is wearing the little black pumps.
From the May Queen tapestry. Now looking inside, the products are presented in these beautiful photographs staged here in Saarinen House and at Kingswood. And even in this photograph here, you can see the cozy corner right behind us.
And the studio describes the products as hand-woven art fabrics, rugs, and window hangings, special commissions only. But the commissions weren't exactly rolling in, and just a year after this pamphlet, in 1933, the Great Depression forced the closing of all the other arts and crafts studios. Loja Saarinen, she stays open, but she has to let most of her weavers go. Some return to Sweden, some stay in Metro Detroit, but she is going to persevere and keep trying to make her enterprise work. It was in 1933 that Loja Saarinen opened up a new showroom across the street, and she had some quirky exhibition techniques like showing off upholstery fabric wrapped around a lamp and the lamp doubling as a flower pot.
Sales were slow, but she continued to exhibit rugs and curtains. We can see some of her samples here. And she also had a new focus on smaller items, like this beautiful hand-woven scarf and this purse with two-sided designs.
And these small things sold easier than the massive rugs, but she didn't have a ton of stock. And so in some photographs, you can see that she's using her own bath mat as a pillow.
She staged her photo shoots in Saarinen House, where she showed upholstery textiles like this much denser and more lustrous weave, as well as objects designed by her daughter, Pipsan Saarinen Swanson, like this beautiful green textile we see here.
Now, it wasn't all sort of small things and curtains or giant rugs for Cranbrook. She also had clients throughout the country, whether it was a restaurant in Chicago or on Fifth Avenue, the Richard Hudnut Salon. Even in Rockefeller Center, there were Loja Saarinen rugs. But the real masterpiece of this period is the 1935 Cranbrook map. It's another instance of Loja, like she did with the architectural models, representing Eliel's architecture through a new artistic medium. The map hanging shows the Cranbrook School for Boys and Kingswood School for Girls, the Institute of Science, all at different sort of architectural scales and types of representation. And in the center is Academy Way.
You can even see the arts and crafts studios where these textiles were produced. And if you look closely at the Saarinen House courtyard, you can see the sculpture Kivi's Muse.
And then down in the corner, there's a charming votive image, and it shows Eliel Saarinen with a painter's palette and a house. He's handing the house to a penguin, and that's George Booth in his penguin suit, and they're standing on top of the Cranbrook Pavilion.
It was in the Cranbrook Pavilion where this hanging was first exhibited in the exhibition of home furnishings in 1935. The exhibition was really a family collaboration.
A highlight of the exhibit was a room for a lady. This interior was done for the Metropolitan Museum of Art and then installed at Cranbrook a little later. And a room for a lady featured a rug from Studio Loja Saarinen, a dress designed and made by Pipsan herself, silver from Pipsan and from Eliel, and then the focus of the room was this hanging.
The weave is incredible. It has all of these different weights of yarn that seem to sort of shimmer in the light.
I love the little bird that seems to be leaping out of the tree, and it's in Loja's favorite color. She wore a lot of this coral, and she used it quite a bit in her textiles.
So in addition to a room for a lady, the exhibition also featured formal and informal table arrangements.
And All of this, it wasn't just an art display, it was all for sale. And in the pamphlet, Loja even says, special orders will be executed. She was always trying to drum up business and attention to the studio.
And Loja's textiles were exhibited to much wider audiences than just at Cranbrook, with some 27 exhibitions between 1928 and 1942 throughout the world.
Now, in the late 30s, she was still weaving for architectural commissions. She did weavings for Charles Eames and Frank Lloyd Wright, including for the Kaufman office in Pittsburgh.
One of the last great commissions for Studio Loja Saarinen is the Sermon on the Mount tapestry for a church in Columbus, Indiana.
This gouache and color pencil drawing is just incredible, and it shows the skill of Eliel Saarinen as a draftsman. The tapestry was made by Lillian Holm and Ruth Ingverson, two of the weavers who had been with Loja Saarinen since 1929.
We know that after the tapestry was finished, Loja Saarinen came back in with her needle and thread and picked out some of the brilliant colors of the tapestry.
There was actually no room big enough at Cranbrook to display this piece, and so they used Carl Millis's sculpture studio, using one of his hoists to lift the 12 by 27 foot tapestry up for display.
The Sermon on the Mount tapestry, along with rugs and curtains for the Cranbrook Art Museum and Library, are really the final moments of Studio Loja Saarinen. They bring to a close a 14-year career in the weaving department here at Cranbrook.
Even with all these efforts, Loja and her studio were, it seems, constantly in the background of other Academy artists. As the institution changed and formalized around her, and departments of architecture, sculpture, and painting joined the craft departments, Loja was not included among the Academy leadership with her male artist peers. In a 1939 letter, she lists her accomplishments, writing, "I tried to find in vain my name in the Academy news. Didn't you think my activities were enough important to mention?" And then she lists exhibits in Toledo, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and at the 1939 World's Fair in San Francisco. She signs it, "That's all!" Loja. By 1942, war was raging overseas, and at home, Eliel stepped down from president of the Academy. The record is unclear, but it seems that it was assumed Loja would also be leaving her professional duties at Cranbrook. She writes to George Booth, "When Mr. Saarinen brought me the sad news that from next semester on, I am not any longer the head of the weaving department, there came a few questions in my mind." This pretty sad letter. She writes that, "As you know, besides being the head of the weaving department, I have also supervised the interior decoration at the Academy, and for the last 2 years, I have, with your consent, planned the planting around the museum building. Would you like me to drop also these activities or not? Also, I would like to know if I can continue to use my weaving studio as before." You can read the disappointment and confusion and even anger in her clear and elegant script. After 14 years of hard work and hundreds of projects woven and sold under her name, Studio Loja Saarinen closed. Eliel died in 1950, and Loja soon moved into a house designed by her son just outside the Cranbrook campus. In the 1950s, Loja returned to the art form of her youth, what she thought would have been her career, sculpture. She made a lifelike bust of Eliel and had 3 bronze castings made. As Eliel's portrait of Loja from 1922 captured his wife's grace and quiet reserve, Loja's posthumous portrait of her husband captured his kind dignity and gentle demeanor. These are a touching pair of portraits by 2 multi-talented artists who loved each other. In her later years, Loja rarely practiced art or design. Instead, she focused on securing the legacy of her architect husband and then her son. In a photo from the late 1960s, we see Loja surrounded by items from her life and career. The Studio Loja Saarinen rug and bench raya from Saarinen House, the antique Finnish Scots from their home in Helsinki, a double portrait of father and son, and the bust of Eliel she sculpted. And Loja stands dignified in her 1934 crandemonium gown, touching the womb chair designed by her son. As her health declined, Loja kept up her reputation as a consummate hostess and continued to meet with Cranbrook students over chocolates at home. She always insisted her hair be set at the salon and that she always be surrounded by art. In 1968, Loja passed away.
In 1978, the New York Times ran a feature on Saarinen House. It included images of an elegant, late modern interior with furniture by Academy of Art designers like Florence Knoll and Errol Saarinen, and contemporary art by George Ortman and Roy Slade. Perhaps most jarring was the off-white, wall-to-wall carpeting by Jack Lenore Larson instead of the painterly, hand-knotted rugs of Loja Saarinen. When I arrived at Cranbrook as a young curator in 1985, most all of Loja's rugs were gone from the floors of Saarinen House. But there was a renewed and growing appreciation for Cranbrook's early history. I worked with the then president of the Academy, Roy Slade, to begin restoration work that would more closely align the house to the Saarinen's original vision. Through careful study of the blueprints, archival photographs, and institutional records, and with support from the Saarinen family, we began transforming the house. Critical to the restoration and fundamentally changing how I understood the house was the reweaving and reinstallation of Studio Loja Saarinen's rugs and curtains. As an architectural space, the house was beautifully proportioned, but it was Loja's textiles that transformed it into a total work of art. Working with young Academy Fiber Department students and graduates like Paula Stebbins-Becker, and studying fragments of original curtain panels that had been carefully saved by Anna Danielson, a former Studio Loja Saarinen weaver who became the Saarinen's housekeeper, we recreated the missing Saarinen House textiles. Textiles don't live forever. As our curator has repeatedly pointed out, even restorations need restoring. This requires not just adjusting the narrative, it also means remaining committed to the physical integrity of the textiles in the house. We opened Saarinen House as a museum in 1994. Our tours focused on Eliel Saarinen's role. Now we are committed to telling a fuller, more complete story. A story that allows Loja Saarinen to stand side by side with Eliel as the co-creator of these interiors.
All the parts come together like a beautiful orchestra. The various instruments are complementing one another and are designed to operate together as a unit. That is, I think, the success of Kingswood. It's only unfortunate in this period of time that not everything is in place, especially many of the textiles. When you walk into a room and you have a carpet underfoot, you become part of that environment. You are making contact with the art through your body, and that contact then extends out to the edges of the carpet, beyond that to the edges of the room, to the walls, to the ceiling, to the windows, to the doors, everything. All of the components needed to be part of that environment.
There's an amazing photo that shows the weavers of the Rose Lobby rug laying out on the manicured lawns of Cranbrook with their pride and joy. There's another photo 25 years later that shows Loja Saarinen at an event here in the Rose Lobby. She must have been so proud of her achievement and her contributions to the Cranbrook community. But by 1980, these rugs had been rolled up and put into storage or worn threadbare and thrown out. It's a dream of mine to bring back the textiles of Studio Loja Saarinen and to be able to tell the full story of her remarkable legacy. So where can we find Loja Saarinen? I think we've seen it takes a lot of work and a lot of investigation, and I don't think it should. By bringing the textiles of Studio Loja Saarinen back into the buildings of Cranbrook, we would more fully understand her story. So who was Loja Saarinen? She was not really a weaver. She was a designer, she was an entrepreneur, she was an organizer, she was an architectural model maker and a landscape architect. She was the First Lady of Cranbrook, and she was a vital piece in the construction of Cranbrook as a total work of art.